This is the first of a series of 3 lessons based on the book called Church, Why Bother by Philip Yancey. And I want to start by explaining the author's history in the church because that becomes important as we go on in this lesson. He was brought up in a strict fundamentalist church in the Deep South. He learned to view God as an abusive parent. God was very rigid, legalistic, and angry. He was taught about love and grace, but he didn't really experience it very much. So as he got older, he eventually drifted away from the faith and then threw it completely away. He did come back to church, and this happened slowly. First, he started to encounter things that were a world of beauty and goodness, and he realized that maybe God had been misrepresented. So he started to circle the church again, warily at first, trying to see if maybe this other faith might be true. So where we're going to start is by looking, is church really necessary for a believing Christian? Can we worship alone? Why do we need church? Well, yeah, of course we can worship alone, but we need a community of believers. We need each other. Church is the place where believers can love one another, encourage one another, spur one another to love and good works, serve one another, instruct one another, honor one another, and be kind and compassionate to one another. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 to 25 says, "And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." So now we know what the Bible says about why we should attend church. So why do some people stay away? What are some of the barriers that keep people away? The author came up with 2 barriers specific to him about why he stayed away from church for a while, but these aren't unusual. The first is hypocrisy, and hypocrisy is defined as the practice of claiming to have moral standards or beliefs to which one's own behavior does not conform. He says, "On Sunday mornings, Christians dressed up in fine clothes and smiled at each other, but I knew that from personal experience that such a facade could cloak a meaner spirit. I had a knee-jerk reaction against anything that smacked of hypocrisy until one day the question occurred to me, what would church look like if every member were just like me? Properly humbled, I began concentrating on my own spirituality, not everyone else's. God is the ultimate judge of hypocrisy in the church. I decided I would leave such a judgment in God's capable hands. I began to relax and grow softer, more forgiving of others. After all, who has a perfect spouse or perfect parents or children? We do not give up on the institutions of family because of its imperfections, so why give up on the church?" The second barrier that kept him away were cultural barriers. A formal church service with its unvarying routine, its repetitiveness, its crowds and bulletins and announcements, its conventions of standing up and sitting down annoyed me. The longer you stay away from church, the stranger it seems, and clearly, I had gotten out of the habit. So what changed my attitude towards church? Church has filled in me a need that could not be met in any other way. St. John of the Cross wrote, "The virtuous soul that is alone is like a burning coal that is alone. It will grow colder rather than hotter." I believe he is right. Christianity is not a purely intellectual internal faith. It can only be lived in community. Perhaps for this reason, I have never entirely given up on the church. At a deep level, I sense that church contains something I desperately need. Whenever I abandon church for a time, I find that I am the one who suffers. My faith fades and the crusty shell of lovelessness grows over me again. I grow colder rather than hotter, and so my journeys away from church have always circled back inside. So what did the author learn as he came back to church? He says, "When I go to church, I have learned to look up, look around, look outward, and look inward. This new way of seeing has helped me to stop merely tolerating the church and instead learn to love it." The first thing we're going to look at is focusing on looking up. And Mr. Yancey says that when he first started going back to church, he would approach church as a discriminating consumer. He wanted that church to provide something that he likes, and he wanted entertained. And in thinking like this, we are the audience in a worship service. We are there to be entertained. But who is the audience of our worship in church? Well, it should be God, right? So the ministers and the praise team and all of those people are up on the stage. What role do they play? What role do the ministers, the music, the sacraments, and the other trappings play in a worship service? These are all promptings to support the ultimate goal of getting worshipers in touch with God. Church exists primarily not to provide entertainment or to encourage vulnerability or to build self-esteem or to facilitate friendships, but to worship God. If it fails in that, it fails. So how do we know if we're meeting the goal of worship, if we're really worshiping God? When we leave worship, do we ask, what did I get out of it? Or do we ask, was God pleased with what happened? This helps us to put the focus on God and not on our own entertainment. God is interested in the sacrifice of the heart, an internal attitude of submission and thanksgiving. Now when I attend church, I try to focus on that internal spirit rather than sitting back in my pew, like a theater critic making aesthetic judgments. By focusing on the trappings and not the goal of worship to meet God, I had missed the most important message of all. The other thing Mr. Yancey said here that really helped me is that he says he looks upward beyond the platform towards God. So that helps him remember to focus on God and not on whoever might be on the stage. The second part of learning to love church is to look around. In the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. used to say, quoting Billy Graham, that 11 o'clock a.m. on Sunday was the most segregated hour in America, and now Jesse Jackson can safely repeat the same saying. Little has changed to bring heterogeneity to worship. I came to marvel. Oh, hang on. We need to talk about the author's experience at LaSalle Street Church in Chicago, and he spent 13 years there. LaSalle Street Church was located between a rich and a poor neighborhood, so they were always looking at socioeconomic differences between the people that attended. There were graduate students and there were young professionals, but there were also people that were homeless. There were a lot of senior citizens, and it was very ethnically diverse. What he learned at LaSalle, he says, I came to marvel at the gospel's ability to speak simultaneously to rich professionals and also street people with no education. And I began to look forward to church as a place that surrounded me with people different from me. On the surface, we had little in common. Our commitment to Jesus Christ, however, gave us much in common. So what model do we have for seeking diversity in the church? Why should we try to fill it with people that are different than us, or not different in some ways anyway? How easily we forget that the Christian church was the first institution in the history of the world to bring together on equal footing Jews and Gentiles, men and women, slaves and free. The earliest Christians broke down barriers. Unlike most other religions, Christians welcomed men and women alike. The Greeks excluded slaves from most social gatherings, while Christians included them. The Jewish temple separated worshipers by race and gender. Christians brought them together around the Lord's table. In contrast to Rome's mostly male aristocracy, the Christian church let women and the poor take leadership roles. The Christian basis for community, the reconciling love of God, transcends all differences in nationality, race, class, age, and gender. Our commonality comes first. The issues that divide us come later. So now that we're done looking around in the church, we're going to start looking outward. The church, said Archbishop William Temple, is the only cooperative society in the world that exists for the benefits of non-members. The author realized that at LaSalle Street, one of the reasons the congregation of such diversity worked well was that they banded together to reach out to the community around them. They actively served others, and when you do this, it causes you to think less about serving yourself. Evangelist Luis Palau captured the metaphor of the nature of the church in an earthy metaphor. The church, he said, is like manure. Pile it together and it stinks up the neighborhood. Spread it out and it enriches the world. So why do we need to reach out to those in need? Who does it benefit? If outreach is the most important factor in a church's success and failure, is it only helping the people that we reach out to? In LaSalle Street, many of the people volunteered out of a sense of guilt or responsibility. Over time, however, they learned that one of the main benefits of giving was its effect on the giver. Our need to give is every bit as desperate as the poor's need to receive. Outreach may at first seem like a drain of energy and resources. I have found it to be just the opposite. In a paradox of faith, the one who shares love comes away enriched, not impoverished. And we're going to talk more about ministry and outreach in the third chapter. Finally, we're going to start looking inward. And when we look at inward, we're going to talk about grace. Grace makes its appearance in so many forms that I have trouble defining it. I am ready, though, to attempt something like a definition of grace in relation to God. Grace means there is nothing we can do to make God love us more. No amount of spiritual calisthenics and renunciations, no amount of knowledge gained from seminaries and divinity schools, no amount of crusading on behalf of religious causes. And grace means there is nothing we can do to make God love us less. No amount of racism or pride or pornography or adultery or even murder. Grace means that God already loves us as much as an infinite God can already love. And that quote came from What's So Amazing About Grace by Philip Yancey on page 70. Grace, I concluded, was the factor most glaringly absent from my childhood church. If only our churches could communicate grace to a world of competition, judgment, and ranking, a world of ungrace, then church would become a place where people gather eagerly without coercion, like desert nomads around an oasis. Now, when I attend church, I look inward and ask God to purge me the poisons of rivalry and criticism and fill me with grace. And I seek out churches characterized by a state of grace. There was a man that attended LaSalle Street Church called Adolphus. On page 34 it says, if Adolphus took his medication on Sunday, he was manageable. Otherwise, well, church could be even more exciting than usual. He might start at the back and high hurdle his way over the pews down to the altar. He might raise his hands in the air during a hymn and make obscene gestures, or he might wear headphones and tune in rap music instead of the sermon. Now, as part of the worship service at LaSalle, they had a section of the worship called Prayers of the People, and anyone could stand up and they could say a prayer, and the people in the congregation would respond, Lord, hear our prayer. Well, Adolphus had some interesting prayers. Once he said, Lord, thank you for creating Whitney Houston and her magnificent body. It says, after a puzzling pause, a few chimed in weakly, Lord, hear our prayer. He also paused for other things like success of his recording contract and that the honky white pastors would see their houses burned down this week. So of course he didn't get any confirmation on those prayers. But Adolphus had been kicked out of 3 other churches. He preferred attending an integrated church because he enjoyed making white people squirm. Fortunately for him, LaSalle Street Church had some mental health professionals, and they had a lot of people that really cared and were willing to work with Adolphus. So eventually, he asked to be a member of the church, and it took him 3 tries, but he was able to demonstrate that he understood what it meant to be a Christian, and he was able to act appropriately, and eventually, he was given membership at LaSalle Street Church. The church did not give up on Adolphus. It gave him a second chance, a third, and a fourth. Christians who had experienced God's grace transferred it to Adolphus, and that stubborn, unquenchable grace gave me an indelible picture of what God puts up with by choosing to love the likes of me. So in these 4 things, we've talked about looking upward toward God, looking around towards the diverse people that are around us, looking outward towards people that are outside that need to know God, that we need to serve, and looking inward and sharing grace with each other and with people that come into our midst. So all of this is pretty idealistic. I am aware, painfully aware, that the kind of church I have described is the exception, not the norm. Many churches offer more entertainment than worship, more uniformity than diversity, more exclusivity than outreach, more law than grace. Nothing troubles my faith more than my disappointment with the visible church. Despite this, we need to be part of a church. There are 2 things we cannot do alone, says Paul Tournier. One is to be married and the other is to be a Christian. In my pilgrimage with the church, I have learned that the church plays a vital, even necessary role. We are God's new community on the earth. The church was God's risk, his gamble, so to speak. I have even come to see in the church's flawed humanity a paradoxical sign of hope. God has paid the ultimate compliment by choosing to live within us vessels of clay. John chapter 15, verse 16 says, You did not choose me, but I chose you, and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. My identity in Christ is more important than my identity as an American, or as a Coloradan, or as a white male, or as a Protestant. Church is the place where I celebrate that new identity and work it out in the midst of people who have many differences but share this one thing in common. We are charged to live out a kind of alternative society before the eyes of the watching world, a world that is increasingly moved towards tribalism and division. So we've learned that the church can be a place where we worship God, of course. We reach out to other people. It's also a place where we get to work out our identity as a Christian. and to show the world that life can be different, that it doesn't have to be all about contemporary society and the way that things look if you only turn on the news. So in summary, why bother with church? The church, I have learned, can indeed be a new sign radically dissimilar to the world's own manner and contradicted in a way which is full of promise. For this reason, church is worth the bother.